Tell her to eat the damn steak. Kevin snapped, his tailored suit shifting as he slammed a heavy hand onto the cracked formica table. The 4 massive men standing behind him immediately stiffened, their hands hovering instinctively near their waistbands. Across the booth, his mother stared out the rain-streaked diner window, her face carved from harsh Russian winter, refusing to acknowledge the English words. The air in the diner had turned to absolute ice. She says it is garbage, the translator stammered, sweating profusely through his expensive collar. She wants. I don't know the exact word, sir. It's a peasant dish. Kevin's jaw clenched. Figure it out, or you're done. That was when Eva stepped forward, wiping her trembling hands on her apron. She doesn't want a translator, Eva said, her voice cutting through the suffocating tension. Then, she spoke to the old woman. In perfect, flawless, aristocratic Russian, the neon sign of the Starlight Diner flickered with a persistent, annoying buzz, casting a sickly, intermittent red glow across the rain-slicked pavement of the parking lot. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, burnt hash browns, and the harsh chemical tang of industrial floor cleaner. It was a Tuesday evening, dreary and suffocatingly slow. The kind of night that stretched on into eternity, testing the patience of anyone trapped within its stagnant hours. Eva stood behind the worn laminate counter, her hands resting on the cool surface, staring blankly out the window at the relentless downpour. Her uniform, a pale blue dress that had seen far too many wash cycles, clung to her tired frame. She shifted her weight from one aching foot to the other, the dull throb in her arches a constant reminder of the 12 hours she had already spent on the clock. Eva was 28. Though the harsh lines forming around her eyes and the perpetual exhaustion etched into her features made her look much older. She lived a life of deliberate invisibility. She kept her head down, served the food, collected her meager tips, and vanished into the shadows of the city when her shift was over. She had spent the last 5 years running from ghosts, hiding her past beneath the dull, uninteresting facade of a midnight diner waitress. The diner was a sanctuary of the mundane, a place where people came to eat cheap food and avoid their own miserable lives. It was exactly where she needed to be. The bell above the glass door chimed, a sharp, cheerful sound that felt wildly out of place in the gloomy atmosphere. Eva didn't look up immediately. She reached for the rag to wipe down the already spotless counter, expecting another tired trucker or a couple of teenagers escaping the rain. But the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It wasn't a gradual change. It was a sudden, violent drop in barometric pressure. The 2 truck drivers sitting at the far booth stopped mid-chew, their eyes widening as they stared toward the entrance. Even the grill cook, a burly man named Marcus who rarely paid attention to anything outside his kitchen, paused with his spatula raised in the air. Eva finally raised her eyes. 4 massive, imposing black SUVs had pulled up directly onto the curb outside, completely disregarding the marked parking spaces. The rain bounced off their polished, armored hoods. The doors opened in perfect synchronization, and men poured out. They were giants, dressed in sharply tailored, dark suits that bulged slightly around the rib cages, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the lack of sun. They moved with terrifying efficiency, securing the perimeter, checking the corners of the diner, their expressions completely devoid of emotion. Then, the diner door swung open wide, and he walked in. Kevin was a man who commanded the very oxygen in the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, radiating an aura of absolute, unchecked power. His suit was bespoke, likely costing more than Eva made in a decade, the dark charcoal fabric absorbing the dim light of the diner. His face was handsome but hardened, characterized by a sharp jawline and eyes that were cold, calculating, and unforgiving. He didn't just walk into the diner. He occupied it. He owned it the moment his leather dress shoes touched the cheap linoleum floor. Eva had seen enough late-night news broadcasts to recognize the quiet, terrifying presence of organized crime. This was not a street thug. This was the apex predator of the city's underworld. But it was the person behind him who truly caught Eva's attention. Flanked by 2 more massive guards, an older woman stepped into the diner. She was small, frail-looking in her stature, but she carried herself with the immovable weight of a glacier. She was draped in a heavy, luxurious mink coat that smelled faintly of expensive, heavy perfume and old money. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, silver knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was a map of deep, tragic lines, her mouth set in a permanent scowl of profound disappointment. She looked around the cheap diner with an expression of unadulterated disgust, her sharp, pale blue eyes dismissing everything they landed on. Marcus, the owner and grill cook, ducked down below the service window, his face pale with absolute terror. "Eva," he hissed, his voice trembling violently. "Eva, you take them. I'm not going out there. Do not make them angry. Just do whatever they want. Give them the whole register if they ask." Eva swallowed hard, the dryness in her throat making it difficult to breathe. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wanted to hide, to slip out the back door into the alley, and run until her lungs burned. But the old woman's eyes suddenly snapped to Eva, locking onto her with a piercing, uncomfortable intensity. There was something in that gaze, a deep, ancient sorrow buried beneath layers of hardened ice, that triggered a distant, painful memory in Eva's mind. Taking a deep, shaking breath, Eva grabbed a fresh order pad, her knuckles turning white, and forced herself to step out from behind the safety of the counter. She walked toward the largest booth in the back corner, where the men were already wiping down the seats before allowing the old woman to sit. The calm before the storm was over. Eva was walking straight into the hurricane. The walk from the counter to the back booth felt like a march across an endless, frozen wasteland. Every step Eva took was heavy, her cheap, rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum, the sound deafening in the unnatural silence of the diner. The two truckers who had been eating quietly had already thrown crumpled bills onto their table and slipped out the door, desperate to avoid whatever was about to happen. The diner was now entirely empty, save for Eva, Marcus trembling in the kitchen, and the towering, terrifying presence of the new arrivals. As Eva approached the table, two of the suited giants instantly stepped into her path, crossing their arms and staring down at her. Up close, they smelled of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of gun oil. Their eyes scanned her rapidly, assessing her as a potential threat. Eva stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat, clutching the order pad to her chest like a meager shield. "Let her through," a voice commanded. It was Kevin. He was sitting across from his mother, his large hands resting flat on the table. His voice was smooth, cultured, but laced with a dangerous undercurrent that brooked no argument. The guards immediately parted, stepping back into the shadows without a single word. Eva stepped up to the edge of the booth. The old woman, Svetlana, was staring out the window again, watching the rain wash over the dark city streets. She hadn't taken off her mink coat, as if sitting in the diner for even a moment would permanently stain her clothing. Kevin looked up at Eva. Up close, his eyes were a startling, piercing gray, sharp enough to cut glass. There was a deep, exhausted tension radiating from him. He was a man used to absolute control, but sitting across from this old woman, he looked entirely out of his depth. "Coffee," Kevin said, his tone brisk and demanding. "Black. 3 of them. And clean these damn mugs before you pour it. Then, bring us the best thing you have on whatever passes for a menu in this place." "Yes, sir," Eva whispered, her voice barely audible over the drumming of the rain. She quickly turned on her heel and practically ran back to the counter. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the heavy glass coffee pot. She grabbed 3 of the cleanest mugs they had, giving them a rapid, desperate wipe with a clean towel, and hurried back to the table. As she poured the steaming black liquid, the silence at the table was oppressive. Then, Svetlana spoke. It wasn't English. It was a low, rapid, guttural string of words, spoken barely above a whisper, directed at the window rather than anyone at the table. Eva froze, the coffee pot hovering in the air, the hot liquid almost spilling over the rim of the mug. She knew that sound. She hadn't heard it in almost 6 years, but the cadence, the harsh consonants, the rolling vowels, it hit her like a physical blow to the chest. It was Russian, but not the standard, polished Russian taught in universities or spoken by politicians. It was a heavy, archaic dialect, thick with the linguistic fingerprints of the deep, remote Ural Mountains. Sitting at the end of the booth, a thin, nervous-looking man in a slightly ill-fitting suit leaned forward. This was Yuri, the translator. He was sweating profusely, dabbing at his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. She says the smell of this place is offensive to her. "Mr. Volkov," Yuri stammered, his eyes darting nervously toward Kevin. She says it smells of poverty and despair. Kevin's jaw tightened. A muscle leaped in his cheek. He reached up and rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long, slow breath. Tell her I know it's not the Ritz. But we had to get off the road. Tell her we will be at the estate in an hour. Just tell her to look at the menu. Yuri cleared his throat and spoke to Svetlana in Russian. Ava, still standing frozen by the table, felt a sudden, sharp pang of irritation. Yuri's Russian was technically correct, but it was stiff, formal, completely lacking the cultural nuance and emotional weight required to speak to an elder from that specific region. He sounded like a textbook, not a person. Svetlana didn't even look at Yuri. She waved a dismissive, elegant hand, flashing a heavy, antique gold ring on her index finger. She spoke again, her voice rising slightly, filled with a deep, unyielding bitterness. The dialect was so thick, so deeply rooted in the rural villages of the old country, that Ava knew instantly Yuri was struggling to comprehend it. She says she does not want to read an American menu, Yuri translated, his voice trembling. She says American food is poison. It has no soul. She refuses to eat here. Kevin slammed his hand flat against the table. The coffee mugs rattled violently, dark liquid sloshing over the brims and staining the formica. Eva jumped backward, her heart leaping into her throat. The guards in the periphery immediately shifted, their hands disappearing inside their jackets. I brought her all the way from Moscow, Kevin growled, his voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal register, ignoring Ava entirely as he glared at the translator. I paid a fortune to get her here safely. She hasn't eaten in 2 days. Tell her she is going to order something from this menu, and she is going to eat it, or I am going to have you drag her back to the plane yourself. Do you understand me? Yuri turned the color of old chalk. He swallowed audibly, terror radiating from him in waves. He turned back to the old woman, his lips trembling as he tried to formulate the translation, knowing that whatever he said was going to escalate the situation into something violent. Eva watched the disaster unfolding, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of the coffee pot. The tension in the diner had reached a breaking point, a taut wire ready to snap and unleash chaos. The silence that followed Kevin's threat was heavy and suffocating. The rain continued to batter the large plate glass window, creating a rhythmic, drumming soundtrack to the impending disaster. Yuri, the translator, looked ready to faint. He loosened his silk tie with trembling fingers, gasping for shallow breaths. He was a highly paid asset for business negotiations, entirely ill-equipped to handle the volatile wrath of a Russian mafia boss and his formidable mother. Madame Volkov, Yuri began, his voice cracking as he attempted formal, placating Russian. Your son insists you consume some nourishment. The establishment offers. Fine cuts of meat, perhaps? Svetlana locked her icy eyes onto Yuri with absolute, devastating contempt. She unleashed a rapid, guttural string of thick, muddy dialect. Eva, rooted to the spot a few feet away, understood every word. Svetlana called Yuri a soulless fool and demanded something from the earth, a specific, heavy stew from the frozen steppes, lamenting how the plastic food of America made her stomach churn. Translate it, Kevin commanded, his voice a vibrating growl. Every damn word. She wants a specific peasant stew, sir, Yuri stammered, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple, with root vegetables and bone marrow. It is impossible to order here. Kevin's composure fractured completely. He reached out with blinding speed and grabbed Yuri by the lapels, hauling him halfway across the table. Coffee spilled everywhere. Tell them to cook it. If they can't, you figure it out. If she does not eat tonight, I will leave you in the trunk of a car. Do you understand me? Yuri let out a strangled whimper. Behind the counter, Marcus let out a soft moan of terror and sank all the way to the floor, curling into a ball near the deep fryer. Eva watched the disaster unfolding. She had spent 5 years hiding, scrubbing her accent away to bury the girl she used to be. Revealing herself to a room full of Russian mafia was a death wish, but looking at the old woman's bone-deep exhaustion, Eva felt a surge of defiant, foolish empathy. The woman didn't want to fight. She just wanted to taste home. Taking a deep breath, Eva stepped right into the middle of the storm. Tell her to eat the damn steak, Kevin snapped, giving Yuri one last violent shake. She doesn't want a translator, Eva said, her voice clear, sharp, and remarkably steady. Kevin froze. He slowly turned his head, his piercing gray eyes locking onto the frail waitress. The guards instantly tensed, their hands dropping fully onto their weapons. Eva ignored them all. She stepped past the terrifying Mafia boss and looked directly into Svetlana's aristocratic eyes. And then Eva spoke. The words that tore from Eva's throat felt strange and heavy on her tongue. Ancient tools she hadn't used in half a decade. She didn't just speak Russian. She spoke the exact, obscure, rural dialect of the Ural Mountains that Svetlana had been using. She hit the harsh, rolling consonants with native precision, dipping her vowels into the deep, melancholic cadence that only someone born to that freezing, brutal landscape could truly master. "You do not have to shout at the plastic men, babushka," Eva said in Russian, her voice calm and remarkably gentle. "They do not have the ears for our snow, nor the stomach for our fire. You are asking for solyanka, are you not? The thick way, with the smoked meats and the heavy sour cream, the way the forest wives make it when the frost kills the early wheat." The effect on the room was instantaneous and violently physical. It was as if someone had pulled the plug on the universe, draining all sound and motion from the diner in a single heartbeat. Yuri, still half sprawled across the table where Kevin had dropped him, let his mouth fall open in unadulterated shock, his eyes bulging as he stared at the cheap waitress. The four massive guards in the shadows froze completely, their hands paralyzed over their holsters, completely unable to process the linguistic anomaly they were witnessing. Kevin slowly released his grip on Yuri's suit. He pulled his hands back, his broad shoulders stiffening. He looked at Eva, his sharp, predatory eyes wide with total bewilderment. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, to reassert his dominance over the room, but the words died in his throat. He was entirely silenced by the sheer impossibility of the moment. But it was Svetlana's reaction that truly shifted the gravity of the room. The old woman's permanent, bitter scowl vanished, wiped away as if struck by lightning. Her pale blue eyes, previously cold and dismissive, snapped wide open, flashing with a sudden, desperate vulnerability. She dropped the elegant facade, her hands gripping the edge of the formica table so hard her knuckles turned the color of bone. She leaned forward, staring at Eva as if the young waitress were a ghost rising from the floorboards. For a long, agonizing moment, Svetlana just stared, her chest rising and falling rapidly under the heavy mink coat. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled, entirely stripped of its previous arrogance. "Who are you?" Svetlana whispered in Russian, the dialect thick and desperate. "Where did you learn the tongue of the deep snows? You look like an American street dog, but you speak with the voice of my grandmother's kitchen." Eva did not flinch. She kept her posture straight, her hands clasped respectfully in front of her apron. She felt the terrifying gaze of Kevin burning into the side of her head, but she refused to break eye contact with the old woman. She was no longer a waitress submitting to a customer. She was a younger woman showing absolute respect to a village elder. "I am not an American street dog, madam," Eva replied in Russian, her tone soft but filled with a quiet, undeniable pride. "My name is Evgenia. I was born in the shadows of the Magnitnaya mountain. I know the smell of the iron dust in the snow, and I know how the wind howls through the birch trees before the great freezes." Svetlana let out a sudden, ragged gasp. She brought a trembling, ring-covered hand to her mouth, her eyes shining with sudden, unshed tears. The mention of the mountain, the specific geographical anchor of her childhood, seemed to strike her physically. "What is she saying?" Kevin demanded, his voice finally breaking the silence. It was loud, harsh, and defensive. The sound of a man who suddenly realized he was the most powerless person in the room. "What the hell are you saying to my mother?" Eva turned her head slowly, finally acknowledging Kevin. The fear that had paralyzed her moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a strange, adrenaline-fueled calm. She looked the terrifying Mafia boss directly in his steely gray eyes. "I am speaking to her with respect, Mr. Volkov," Eva said in flawless, unaccented English, dropping the Midwestern twang she usually faked. Her real voice was deeper, smoother, and carried a quiet authority. "Your translator is a city man. He reads books. He does not understand the language of the soil your mother comes from. She is not insulting you. She is simply grieving for a home she believes she will never taste again. She is asking for a very specific, traditional meal that reminds her of her village." Kevin stared at her, completely disarmed. He looked from Eva to his mother, who was still staring at the waitress with wide, tear-filled eyes. The dynamic of the room had completely inverted. The guns, the money, the tailored suits, none of it mattered. The only thing that possessed any power in the diner was the invisible thread of a shared, ancient language tying the broken waitress to the terrifying matriarch. "Can you?" Kevin started, his voice losing its threatening edge, replaced by a strange, desperate uncertainty. He swallowed hard. "Can you make it? This food she wants. Can you actually make it?" Eva looked back at Svetlana. The old woman's eyes were pleading, a silent, desperate prayer for a connection to the world she had lost. Eva felt the heavy weight of her own hidden past pressing down on her shoulders. The memories of her own grandmother's kitchen, the smell of simmering broth, and the warmth of the hearth in the bitter cold. She knew that if she walked into that kitchen, she was fully resurrecting the girl she had tried to bury. "Please, Evgenia," Svetlana whispered in Russian, her voice cracking. "I am so cold in this country. I am dying of the cold." Eva took a slow, deep breath, nodding her head once. She looked back at Kevin, her expression resolute and unyielding. "Yes," Eva said softly. "I can make it." "Then go," Kevin said, his voice surprisingly quiet, stripped of the booming authority he had wielded just moments before. He waved a hand toward the swinging double doors of the kitchen, his gaze locked on Eva with a mixture of intense suspicion and desperate hope. "Go make it. I will pay whatever you ask. Just make her stop looking like that." He gestured helplessly toward his mother. Svetlana was no longer the imposing, terrifying figure who had walked into the diner. She looked small, fragile, her shoulders slumped beneath the heavy fur coat. The hardened shell had cracked, revealing a deeply lonely old woman adrift in an alien world. Eva nodded, turning on her heel. She walked toward the kitchen, the heavy gaze of the 4 guards following her every move, though none of them dared step in her path. As she pushed through the metal double doors, the chaotic reality of the diner's back of house hit her. Marcus, the owner, was standing near the deep fryer, clutching a large, stainless steel spatula like a medieval weapon. He was pale, his apron stained with old grease, and he looked as though he were on the verge of a massive cardiac event. "Eva, what the hell did you just do?" Marcus hissed, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "Are you insane? Do you know who that is out there? That's Kevin Volkov, the Volkov Syndicate. They run the docks, they run the unions, they kill people in broad daylight. What did you say to them? They're going to burn this place down with us inside." "Marcus, shut up and listen to me," Eva snapped, her voice carrying a sharp, commanding edge that she had never used with him before. She walked briskly to the large stainless steel prep station, grabbing a clean apron and tying it tightly around her waist. "They aren't going to burn anything down. The old woman is homesick. She wants a specific dish. Solyanka, a thick Russian peasant soup. If we feed her, they will leave in peace." "Soup? We don't have Russian soup." Marcus panicked, waving his arms frantically at the industrial refrigerators. "We have frozen burger patties, crinkle-cut fries, and expired chili. We're a diner, Eva, not a goddamn Michelin-star Moscow restaurant." "I don't need a Moscow restaurant," Eva said, her eyes scanning the messy kitchen, her mind rapidly cataloging ingredients, adapting the ancient recipe to the cheap diner supplies. "I need you to get out of my way. Give me the biggest stock pot we have. I need onions, garlic, every pickle in the jar, the brine from the pickles, whatever cheap cuts of beef you were saving for the meatloaf, the smoked bacon from the breakfast line, tomato paste, and a bottle of whatever cheap vodka you hide under the counter." Marcus stared at her, mouth agape, completely paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying shift in her demeanor. The quiet, invisible waitress had vanished, replaced by a woman commanding a war room. "Marcus, move!" Eva shouted, slamming a heavy chef's knife onto the cutting board. The sharp crack snapped the owner out of his stupor. For the next 45 minutes, the kitchen transformed into a sacred space, a portal to a world thousands of miles away. Eva moved with a frantic, beautiful precision, muscle memory taking over as she recreated the dish her grandmother had taught her in a tiny, snow-buried kitchen. She began by violently chopping the onions and garlic, tossing them into the massive cast-iron pot with a terrifying amount of butter. As they sizzled, turning translucent and sweet, she threw in the roughly chopped bacon, letting the fat render down, filling the greasy diner kitchen with a sudden, intoxicating aroma of smoked meat and earth. She diced the cheap beef, searing it aggressively in the smoking fat, the hiss and crackle of the meat drowning out the sound of the rain outside. Every action was heavy with memory. As she poured the acidic, sour pickle brine into the pot, the secret, crucial ingredient to authentic solyanka, she remembered the massive wooden barrels in her grandmother's cellar. As she stirred the thick, red tomato paste, she remembered the frost on the windows, the sound of the balalaika playing from a scratchy radio, the feeling of absolute safety before her world had violently shattered, forcing her to flee across oceans with nothing but the clothes on her back. Outside, in the dining room, the atmosphere was thick with a strange, suspended anticipation. Kevin sat in the booth, staring through the small rectangular window in the swinging kitchen doors. He watched Eva moving, a blur of frantic energy, a master craftsman at work. He had never seen someone cook with such violent, desperate passion. He looked at his mother. Svetlana had taken off her heavy mink coat, folding it neatly beside her. She was sitting up straighter, her eyes closed, breathing deeply. The scent of the rendering bacon, the sharp tang of the cooking onions and garlic, and the unmistakable sour depth of the simmering pickle brine were beginning to seep under the kitchen doors and fill the diner. Svetlana let out a long, shuddering sigh. It was the sound of a woman who had been holding her breath for 20 years and was finally, miraculously, allowed to exhale. Kevin felt a strange tightness in his chest. He had bought his mother mansions, imported luxury cars, wrapped her in diamonds and furs to make up for the brutal poverty of her youth, and she had remained a statue of ice, miserable and condemning. Yet, this cheap waitress in a run-down, roadside diner, armed with nothing but a pot and some onions, was systematically dismantling the iron fortress his mother had built around her heart. The kitchen doors suddenly swung open. The violent sizzling stopped, replaced by a heavy, profound silence. Eva stepped out, carrying a large, deep ceramic bowl. Steam rolled off the surface in thick, fragrant waves. She walked slowly, reverently, toward the back booth. The guard stepped back entirely, clearing a path as if she were carrying a holy relic. The smell of the solyanka hit the table rich, sour, impossibly deep, smelling of wood smoke, old earth, and survival. Eva set the bowl down gently in front of Svetlana. She had garnished it perfectly, despite the diner's limitations. A heavy dollop of thick sour cream floating in the center of the dark red broth, a sprinkle of fresh dill she had miraculously found in the walk-in, and a thick wedge of lemon. "Eat, babushka," Eva said softly in Russian, stepping back and clasping her hands. "The snow is heavy tonight. You need the fire." Svetlana opened her eyes. She looked down at the bowl. The steam curled up, wrapping around her face, carrying the ghosts of 1,000 lost memories directly into her soul. The diner was so quiet you could hear the soft, rhythmic hum of the neon sign outside bleeding through the glass. No one moved. The massive men in tailored suits stood frozen like statues in the periphery. Kevin leaned forward slightly, his sharp gray eyes locked intensely on his mother, his hands resting flat on the table, bracing himself for an explosion. He had seen men break under torture without showing as much raw vulnerability as his mother was displaying over a bowl of soup. Svetlana's hands were trembling violently. She slowly reached out, her antique gold rings clinking softly against each other, and picked up the heavy silver spoon Eva had polished to a shine. The old woman's face was a theater of conflicting emotions, profound disbelief, warring with a desperate, terrifying hope. She looked as though she were afraid the bowl was an illusion that would vanish the moment the metal touched the broth. She dipped the spoon in, breaking the surface of the rich, red liquid, gathering a small amount of the thick sour cream, a piece of the simmered meat, and the fragrant dill. She raised it to her lips, her eyes closing tightly. Bracing herself, she took the first sip. For a single, agonizing second, nothing happened. Svetlana sat perfectly still, the spoon resting gently against her lower lip. Then, a violent shudder ripped through her small, frail frame. It started in her shoulders and cascaded down her spine, a physical reaction to a memory that had been buried alive. The heavy, unyielding mask of the terrifying Mafia matriarch shattered entirely. Svetlana dropped the spoon. It clattered loudly against the rim of the bowl, a sharp sound that made Kevin flinch. She brought both of her trembling hands to her face, pressing her palms against her eyes, and let out a sound that chilled everyone in the room to the bone. It was not a cry of pain, nor a simple weep of sadness. It was a deep, guttural sob of absolute, overwhelming catharsis. It was the sound of a dam breaking after decades of agonizing pressure. Tears poured down her wrinkled cheeks, slipping through her fingers and dropping onto the cheap formica table. She wept with a raw, unfiltered intensity, her narrow chest heaving with the force of her sobs. "Mama," Kevin whispered, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its lethal authority. He half stood, reaching a large, powerful hand across the table, hovering awkwardly near her shoulder. Completely terrified by this display of raw emotion, he had never seen his mother cry. Not when they fled Russia in the dead of night. Not when his father was gunned down in the streets of Brighton Beach. Not when Kevin had taken over the syndicate with ruthless, bloody ambition. She had always been made of iron and frost. Svetlana waved his hand away with a frantic gesture, refusing to be comforted. She wiped her face with the back of her trembling hand, her eyes red and swimming with tears, and looked up at Eva. The old woman reached across the table, her small, cold hand shooting out and grabbing Eva's wrist with surprising, desperate strength. Her grip was like a vice. "You have the hands of the angels, Evgenia," Svetlana whispered in Russian, her voice thick with tears, the words stumbling over themselves in her haste to get them out. "The sourness, the smoke. It is exactly how my sister made it. Exactly. Before the war. Before the hunger took everything. You did not just make soup, child. You brought my ghost back to sit with me." Eva felt a lump rise in her throat, thick and painful. She didn't pull her wrist away. She let the old woman hold her, feeling the erratic, desperate pulse beneath Svetlana's thin skin. The professional distance of the waitress was entirely gone. Eva was suddenly just a girl again, standing in the presence of a grieving elder, sharing a profound, unspeakable pain. "I know the ghosts, babushka," Eva replied softly in Russian, her own voice wavering, the carefully constructed walls of her new identity crumbling down around her. "I cook for them too. It is the only way to keep them warm." Kevin watched the exchange, his mind reeling. He didn't speak Russian, but he didn't need to. The emotional translation was undeniable, painted vividly across both women's faces in broad, devastating strokes. The hardened, ruthless kingpin felt a sudden, sharp sting of tears welling in his own eyes. He quickly blinked them away, looking down at his polished shoes, struggling to process the monumental shift in reality. All his money, all his power, the empire of fear he had built to protect this woman, it was all worthless compared to the bowl of cheap meat and pickle brine sitting on the table. Svetlana picked the spoon back up with a shaking hand. She began to eat. She didn't eat with the refined, arrogant manners she had displayed earlier. She ate ravenously, desperately, like a starving woman who had finally found sustenance in a desert. She consumed the broth, the meat, the softened vegetables, closing her eyes with every swallow, tears continuing to trace silent paths down her deeply lined face. The entire diner watched in absolute silence. The massive guards shifted uncomfortably, averting their eyes, instinctively knowing they were witnessing something intensely private and sacred. When the bowl was completely empty, scraped clean of every last drop of broth, Svetlana set the spoon down. She let out a long, ragged breath, resting her hands flat on the table. The deep, angry tension that had radiated from her pores when she arrived was entirely gone. She looked exhausted, completely drained. But for the first time in his life, Kevin saw a strange, profound peace settle over his mother's features. She turned her head slowly, looking at Kevin. Her eyes were still red, but the icy condemnation that usually greeted him was absent. "She is a daughter of the snows," Svetlana said to Kevin in heavily accented, broken English, her voice raspy from crying. It was the first time she had spoken English the entire night. "She knows the true fire. You will respect her, my son. You will bow your heavy head to her." Kevin swallowed hard, the muscles in his thick neck working. He looked from his mother to Eva. The cold, calculating predator in his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, monumental reverence. He slowly stood up from the booth, a mountain of a man in a bespoke suit. He didn't just nod, he bowed his head deeply, a gesture of absolute, undeniable submission to the frail waitress standing before him. "I owe you," Kevin said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that filled the quiet room. "You gave my mother back to me. Tell me what you want. Name your price." Anything in this city, and it is yours. The weight of Kevin's offer hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Anything in this city. Coming from a man who controlled the docks, the unions, and the shadows of the underworld. It was not an empty boast. It was a blank check written in blood and power. Eva stood perfectly still, her hands still resting near Svetlana's on the table. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the frantic cooking process was fading, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She looked at Kevin, at his massive frame and the desperate, genuine gratitude burning in his sharp gray eyes. A few hours ago, she would have been terrified of this man. Now, she just saw a son who loved his mother enough to burn the world down to keep her warm. "I don't want your city, Mr. Volkov," Eva said quietly, her voice steady. She gently pulled her hand back, clasping them together over her stained apron. "I just wanted to feed an elder who was hungry. There is no price for that in my village. It is simply what must be done." Kevin frowned, clearly unaccustomed to being refused. He took a step closer, towering over her, though the threat was entirely absent from his posture. "Everyone wants something. A better job, a house without a leaking roof. Protection. You work in a grease pit that smells like bleach, scrubbing floors for pennies. You don't have to do this anymore. I am offering you a way out. Take it." Svetlana raised her hand, silencing her son with a single, sharp gesture. She turned back to Eva, her eyes narrowing slightly, studying the young woman's face with intense, piercing scrutiny. The maternal warmth was still there, but it was now mixed with a sharp, shrewd intelligence. "A girl who cooks solyanka like my sister does not belong in this plastic box," Svetlana said in Russian, her voice dropping to an intimate, probing whisper. "You hide your fire well, Evgenia. You wear the clothes of a peasant. You scrub the floors like a servant. But your grammar is perfect. Your posture is too straight for a beggar. You speak the dialect of the mountains, but you form the words like a girl who was taught by expensive tutors." Eva stiffened. The blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her pale and drawn in the harsh diner lighting. She took a half step backward, suddenly feeling exposed, as if the old woman had reached into her chest and pulled out her darkest secret. "Who are you hiding from, child?" Svetlana asked, the question hanging in the air like a poised blade. Kevin, sensing the sudden shift in tension, looked back and forth between the two women. Frustrated by the language barrier, but acutely aware of the heavy, dangerous atmosphere settling over the table once again. "What is she saying? What's going on?" he demanded softly. Eva ignored him. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, terrifying rhythm. She looked at the old woman, seeing the fierce, unyielding wisdom in those pale blue eyes. Svetlana knew. You couldn't fake the nuances of social class in the old country. Not to someone who had lived through the revolutions and the purges. "I am hiding from the same things your son's men carry under their coats, babushka," Eva finally whispered in Russian, her voice trembling, the truth bleeding out of her despite her desperate attempts to hold it in. She closed her eyes, the memories crashing over her in a suffocating wave. "My real name is Evgenia Rostova. My father. My father was a magistrate in Yekaterinburg. He made decisions. He refused bribes from the men in the iron syndicates. 5 years ago, they came to our house in the night. They did not knock. They burned the house to the ground with my father and my brother inside. My mother and I escaped through the root cellar. We ran for 2 years. We crossed borders in the trunks of cars, paid smugglers with my mother's wedding jewelry, until we reached this country." Eva opened her eyes, tears finally breaking free, hot and angry, tracking down her cheeks. "My mother died of pneumonia 3 months after we arrived. The cold we ran from finally caught her. I buried her in an unmarked grave because we had no papers. So, I took this name. I took this dress. I became a ghost in this diner because ghosts cannot be hunted." The silence in the diner was absolute. Even the rain outside seemed to hold its breath. Svetlana stared at Eva, her face a mask of profound, devastating horror. Slowly, the old woman reached out with both trembling hands and grabbed Eva's wrists again, pulling the young woman toward her. "Rostova," Svetlana breathed, the name carrying a heavy weight. "I know of this name. A family of iron and honor. And they burned you out." The old woman let out a low, mournful sound, a keening wail that seemed to originate from the very center of her soul. She stood up, ignoring the protest of her frail joints, and wrapped her arms around Ava. It wasn't a gentle hug. It was a fierce, desperate embrace. The kind a mother gives a child pulled from the wreckage of a burning building. "You are a ghost no longer, Evgenia Rostova," Svetlana whispered fiercely into Eva's ear, her tears soaking into the cheap fabric of the waitress uniform. "You fed my soul tonight. I will not let the wolves of this world take yours." Svetlana pulled back, keeping her hands firmly on Ava's shoulders. She turned to Kevin, her expression transforming instantly from a grieving woman to the terrifying, commanding matriarch she truly was. The shift was magnificent and terrifying. "Kevin," Svetlana said in English, her voice ringing out like a cracked iron bell. "You listen to me? You listen to your mother?" Kevin instantly stood at attention, his back straight, the ruthless mob boss suddenly looking like an obedient soldier. "Yes, Mama, this girl," Svetlana commanded, pointing a trembling, ring-covered finger directly at Eva's chest. "She is blood now. She is family. She has no mother. I have no daughter to cook the old ways. You will put your mantle over her. You will build a wall of iron around her. If anyone from the old country, if anyone in this city, ever looks at her with a dark eye, you will tear their throat out. Do you understand me?" Kevin didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand to know the details of the Russian conversation. He looked at Eva, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a cheap waitress, not as a charity case, but as a survivor who had fought through hell and emerged with enough grace to cook a meal for a bitter old woman. "I understand, Mama," Kevin said, his voice a deep, absolute vow that resonated in the small diner. He looked directly into Eva's tear-filled eyes. "You're under my roof now. Nobody touches you, ever again." The aftermath of the vow was a quiet, sweeping hurricane that entirely dismantled Ava's carefully constructed life of invisibility. For 5 years, she had lived in a perpetual state of low-grade terror, jumping at every loud noise, scrutinizing every new customer who walked through the diner doors, convinced that the men who murdered her family would eventually track her down. But as she stood in the center of the Starlight Diner, surrounded by massive, armed men who were now looking at her not as a threat, but as protected cargo, a strange, overwhelming sense of safety washed over her. It was a terrifying paradox. She was being protected by the very type of dangerous men she had fled from, but the sincerity in Kevin's eyes and the fierce, maternal grip of Svetlana's hands were undeniable. Kevin snapped his fingers, a sharp sound that broke the spell. The 4 guards immediately mobilized. One stepped outside into the pouring rain to bring the SUV closer to the door, while the others formed a tight, protective perimeter around the booth. "Yuri," Kevin barked, not even looking at the trembling translator who was still plastered against the wall. "Get the car ready for my mother. Make sure the heat is on." Yuri scrambled out the door, grateful for an excuse to escape the terrifying intimacy of the room. Svetlana slowly let go of Ava's shoulders. She reached into her mink coat and pulled out a delicate, embroidered silk handkerchief, wiping the remaining tears from her face. She looked dignified again, powerful, but the bitter, icy shell was permanently fractured. She reached out and gently cupped Eva's cheek, her thumb brushing away a stray tear. "Do not be afraid of the fire anymore, Evgenia," Svetlana whispered softly in Russian. "You have walked through it. Now, you let my son be the fire that burns anyone who tries to hurt you." With that, the old woman turned. Kevin stepped forward, offering his thick arm. Svetlana took it, leaning heavily on her massive son, and together they walked slowly toward the exit. The guards moved with them in perfect synchronization, a moving fortress of tailored wool and hidden steel. Kevin stopped just short of the door. He gently handed his mother off to the lead guard, who escorted her out into the rain and toward the idling armored SUV. Kevin turned back, his imposing frame filling the doorway, and walked back toward the counter where Eva was still standing, paralyzed by the monumental shift in her reality. He didn't speak immediately. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out a thick, heavy leather wallet. He didn't pull out a few bills. He reached in and pulled out a massive, tightly bound stack of $100 bills, more money than Eva made in 2 full years of double shifts. He placed the stack gently on the Formica counter. "That's for the soup," Kevin said, his voice low and devoid of any sarcasm. It was a genuine statement of value. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a sleek, matte black business card. It had no logo, no company name, just a single gold-embossed phone number in the center. He placed it carefully on top of the stack of money. Then, he reached over the counter, pulled a pen from the cup next to the register, and flipped the card over. He wrote something quickly on the back. "I meant what I said, Eva," Kevin said, his sharp gray eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. "You don't have to work in this place anymore. Tomorrow morning a car will come here. You pack whatever you want to keep. You leave the rest. The car will take you to a restaurant I own downtown. It's a nice place, clean, safe. You will walk in, tell the manager your name, and you will run the kitchen. You cook whatever you want. You cook my mother's soup. You cook your family's recipes. You will be paid what you are worth. And you will never, ever have to look over your shoulder again." Eva stared at the black card, her breath catching in her throat. The offer was overwhelming. It was a complete erasure of her nightmare, handed to her by a man who made nightmares for a living. "Why?" Eva asked, her voice barely a whisper, looking up at him. "Why are you doing this?" The soup was just broth and meat. Kevin smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened the harsh, brutal angles of his face. It made him look less like a kingpin and more like a deeply tired, incredibly grateful son. "You don't get it," Kevin said softly. "I have spent the last 10 years trying to buy my mother's happiness. I bought her a house overlooking the ocean. I bought her diamonds the size of her knuckles. I gave her everything a man can buy with blood and money, and she hated me for it. She sat in those mansions and she froze to death from the inside out." He reached out and tapped the heavy ceramic bowl still sitting on the table in the booth. "You gave her the one thing I couldn't buy," Kevin continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave her home. You made her smile. You made her human again. For that, Evgenia Rostova, you have the entire Volkov syndicate standing behind you. Nobody touches you. Not the men from your past. Not the men in this city. You are untouchable." He gave her one last, deeply respectful nod, then turned and walked out the door. The bell chimed a cheerful, oblivious sound. The heavy glass door swung shut, cutting off the sound of the rain and the roaring engines of the SUVs. Eva stood alone in the quiet diner. She walked slowly over to the counter and looked down at the massive stack of money and the black card resting on top of it. She reached out with trembling fingers and picked the card up, flipping it over to read what Kevin had written on the back. It was written in surprisingly neat, elegant Russian script. "For the daughter of the snows, welcome to the family." The silence in the Starlight Diner was profound, broken only by the steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the plate glass window and the low, terrified whimpering coming from the kitchen. Eva stood frozen at the counter, the black business card feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. She stared at the handwritten Russian script until the Cyrillic letters blurred and swam before her tear-filled eyes. "Welcome to the family." The phrase was terrifying in its implications, yet wrapped in an undeniable blanket of absolute security. She was no longer Evgenia, the hunted refugee, nor was she Eva, the invisible waitress. She existed in a strange, liminal space, a civilian protected by the apex predators of the city, shielded by a bowl of sour soup and the memories of a dead grandmother. Slowly, the paralysis broke. Eva slipped the black card into the deep pocket of her apron, pressing her hand against it to ensure it was real. She ignored the massive stack of $100 bills resting on the formica. The money was meaningless compared to the promise written on the card. She took a deep, shuddering breath and walked toward the swinging double doors of the kitchen. Marcus was still huddled on the floor near the deep fryer, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. He looked up as Eva entered, his eyes wide with frantic animal terror, expecting to see Kevin's massive guards dragging her back to be executed. When he saw her standing there, unharmed, her apron stained with flour and broth, he let out a loud, pathetic gasp of relief. "They're gone?" Marcus croaked, his voice cracking violently. He scrambled awkwardly to his feet, leaning heavily against the stainless steel prep table. "Are they gone, Eva? Did they leave? Are they coming back to burn us out?" "They are gone, Marcus," Eva said quietly, her voice entirely stripped of the deferential, quiet tone she had used with him for 5 years. She walked over to the sink and turned on the hot water, beginning to scrub the grease and flour from her hands with slow, deliberate movements. "What? What did you do? Marcus asked, stepping closer, his fear slowly morphing into intense, bewildered curiosity. I heard shouting. I heard the old woman crying. And then, nothing. They just walked out. Kevin Volkov just walked out of my diner without breaking a single glass. What the hell was in that soup? Eva turned off the water and reached for a coarse paper towel. She dried her hands, looking around the dirty, cramped kitchen that had been her prison and her sanctuary for half a decade. She looked at the peeling linoleum, the sputtering deep fryer, the stack of frozen, soulless burger patties waiting to be thawed. It was just soup, Marcus, Eva replied, her voice calm and remarkably steady. It was just a recipe from my village. She walked back out into the dining room, Marcus trailing cautiously behind her like a frightened dog. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the booth. The empty ceramic bowl sat in the center of the table, a testament to the miracle that had occurred. But Marcus wasn't looking at the bowl. His eyes were locked, wide and bulging, on the counter. Mother of God. Marcus breathed, his legs giving out slightly as he rushed forward, staring at the brick of $100 bills sitting next to the register. He reached out a trembling hand, hovering over the money but terrified to actually touch it, as if it were rigged to explode. Eva, there has to be $10,000 here. Maybe more. He left this? For soup? It's not for the soup, Eva said, walking past him and untying her stained apron. She folded it neatly, deliberately, and laid it across the back of one of the vinyl stools. It's for the peace of mind. Half of it is yours, Marcus. For the ingredients I used, and for the mess. Marcus snapped his head up, staring at her as if she had suddenly grown a second head. Half? Eva, this is Volkov money. This is blood money. If we take this... He gave it freely. Eva interrupted, her tone brokering no argument. Take your half, Marcus. Fix the roof. Buy better coffee. Pay yourself back for the years you spent hiding behind the fryer. She reached out, smoothly dividing the massive stack of bills, sliding half of the fortune across the counter toward the bewildered owner. She took her half and shoved it unceremoniously into her cheap, worn canvas tote bag sitting under the register. What are you doing? Marcus asked, his voice laced with sudden panic as he watched her shoulder the bag. Your shift doesn't end for another 3 hours, Eva. The rain is still coming down. You can't just leave. Eva stopped at the glass door, her hand resting on the cool metal handle. She looked back at Marcus, at the dirty diner, at the flickering neon sign that had been her only beacon for so long. She felt a profound, overwhelming sense of finality. The ghost was dead. Evgenia Rostova was finally breathing again. My shift is over, Marcus, Eva said softly, a small, genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth for the first time in years. My shift is permanently over. I have a new kitchen to run tomorrow. She pushed the door open. The cheerful bell chimed one last time, a bright, ringing sound that no longer felt out of place. Eva stepped out into the cool, pouring rain, the black card burning a hole in her pocket, and walked away from the Starlight Diner, leaving her shadows behind in the dark. Eva's story proves that our deepest power doesn't come from weapons, wealth, or hiding our true selves. It comes from the courage to connect. By offering a simple bowl of soup and speaking the language of a forgotten home, she didn't just disarm a mafia empire. She healed a broken family and reclaimed her own stolen identity. True humanity, shared through culture and empathy, can melt even the thickest armor. If this story of hidden truths and unexpected redemption moved you, please leave a like. Share it with someone who appreciates the power of empathy. And subscribe for more intense, emotionally driven cinematic stories. Your support helps us bring more of these powerful, real-life feeling narratives to life.